John Cutler, thank you so much for joining us today. For anybody who doesn't know John and his work, John is currently the head of product at DotWork. You've led product enablement at Toast, and you are also the head of product education at Amplitude. But I think most notably, you're super well known for your thought leadership on social media and your blog, The Beautiful Mess. So John, thank you so much for coming today. How's everything going? How are you feeling?
Good. I'm ready. This is exciting. Thanks, Mackenzie and Darren. This is going to be great.
Awesome. So we are three operators, and we know that operations is anything but simple. And John, a lot of the things that you talk about are the, messiness, the uncertain certains about operating specifically in the product scape. Um, so I want to talk a lot about that. I think you're somebody who just understands this completely, and from following you for quite some time, just the insights that you share around all things product operations and operating in really complex environments has been really, really interesting to me. And you've navigated a lot of different, you know, companies and scenarios. So we're going to dig right into that. Um, so starting off, I think, the John Cutler most people know is the product thought leader, the systems thinker who's really not afraid to get into the political dialogue on LinkedIn. But recently, when we first talked, I learned you're also a Southern Californian and you're a dad. And that made me think, I'm like, who is the John Cutler beyond the beautiful mess and the LinkedIn threads, right? Like, I'm curious what parts of you we don't see in that writing, sort of the stuff that shapes how you show up, but maybe doesn't make it into the posts.
I mean, I think when you're a parent and then you're trying to work at the same time, work and parenthood just becomes one thing in the same.
Yeah,
So for the past, 6 odd years or 7 odd years, that's been a lot of it. And when I think about it that way, that's pretty crazy. That means, I started writing in around 2014, 2015. And shortly thereafter, so, three years of not being a parent, and then the rest is being a parent and doing those things. And there's a pandemic mixed in, um, which is kind of scary to say, though all these things sort of melded into one.
yeah,
I live in Santa Barbara. It's sunny. It's nice. You have a kid. You're working. There's not a lot to it. I used to be a lot more involved in things like biking and uh, played a lot more music. That was sort of like a former life of being a musician and other things. Yeah, I would say that definitely the last 6 to 7 odd years have just been a lot of work
yeah.
and kids stuff and exploring that part of the thing. I wish I had crazy hobbies to talk about at the moment, but between those things, um, between the writing, which is also something which is kind of like the hobby.
Yeah.
So maybe more
Hobbies are
accurately to
more than
say
that,
is
John, because like the amount of content you create, I'm like, is this man sleeping at all?
I would say that it's a key hobby. So I have to work and then I have the key hobby, which
Yeah.
that's probably the key hobby at the moment. And then being a parent, doing those things. But it has been a lot of writing. Uh, and I look back on old writing, a lot of it sucks. I've definitely been learning and then, exploring things and leaning into these particular things over time.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, if anyone has any great ideas for new, like what are the next hobbies to emerge, could certainly cut down a little bit on the writing and then try some other stuff. So maybe we'll get back into biking or sailing or music. I'm game for all of it, really.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that too, because Darren and I were just talking to a friend who's been in engineering later forever, and we were talking about the interesting differences in generations. Like we have a lot of people coming straight out of college right now, like
Mm.
STEM educated, going right into tech companies. But well before that, we had, a lot of people coming from very different backgrounds. This particular person was a journalist, but he was like, how many jazz guitarists do we know that have gotten into product and engineering? And it's like, wait, actually, probably a lot. And I noticed that you and I had a similar uh sort of, I guess, hobby. I noticed that you were into rowing at NYU, and I was on the crew team myself in high school. And it's like, I think a lot of us creatives sort of have gotten into this type of work. I mean, Darren, you too. You're a super creative person. You come from a very like non-traditional background. Darren was a firefighter before he got into tech. So all of us have had like, these sort of winding journeys.
In Southern
Seems
California, of
like,
all places.
Yep.
So,
oh, nice. There you go.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, one thing I've observed out there at the moment is that it's it's definitely in the last 10 years, it was definitely more possible for someone to jump straight into tech
Yeah.
from a college environment, for example. And, they'll be like, I got my first job out of college and it's at a tech company. It didn't used to be like that a
Yeah.
lot. Like you would, I went to college in New York, and you'd have friends that were like into computers or design or music. I ended up using a lot of computers as it related to music. And you would make things, or I don't know, it's just sort of a
Like
different,
garage
people
band.
slipped more into this type of stuff over time. And I think one of the interesting dynamics right now that's happening in companies is this mix of almost like cultures of how people got into it. There's people who are like, this is my jam. This is why I went to college to become a tech employee. And then meanwhile, when I went to school, it was like, oh, I guess English major, maybe, or what am I doing? And then you see people pivoting their careers with really strong background in other things into technology, and then wrapping their head around it. And that's one of the really interesting things I've discovered is you get people with like a decade or more of experience just being around other people and working and collaborating and doing businessy oriented stuff or whatever. And then they drop into a tech environment. They're like, this is both very familiar, but also very weird at the same time. Like this is a very familiar collaboration situation, but also a very different collaboration system. So yeah, there's a couple things I've been noticing.
John, you've built a reputation as the person who's helped teams embrace uncertainty, see the whole system, and resist easy answers. But that's not the kind of mindset most people start with. How did you come up with that mindset, and what pushed you towards implementing that in your practices?
Yeah, I think it's kind of why I named the newsletter The Beautiful Mess. And certainly I wrote a couple hundred blog posts before then too, just on Medium and stuff that were about this. And I think that the central thread running through all of this is that in certain types of creative work, especially where you're creating something that doesn't exist yet, um, there is just an inherent amount of uncertainty in what you're doing. You're gambling a little bit. You're taking a risk with this. You're learning as you go. You have to work with other people. And I think that because I had a real soft spot for being on teams or playing in bands or creating things with other people. So that drew me to this idea, right? That you could um, be in these situations on teams. I think over the years, I've started to try to think about how to apply that thinking at different levels of resolution across an organization. And I think that's where it gets really, really, really interesting, where this idea that like, look, getting 5 people locally to gel to do something together is almost a minor miracle, like just unto itself. But then extending that across many groups of people or a whole organization, it's like another level of interesting mess. And so I think that you deal with that a lot in operations where you sort of have to try to figure out what you can do to encourage the right interactions at the right time between the right groups of people supported by the right tools and the right ways of how they're working. And so that's something that comes to mind based on your question, where there's the local problem that I was originally inspired by. But I think then over the years, I started to get increasingly inspired by the increasingly inspired by what does that even mean on an organizational level. And that's why I sort of, I had a sort of soft spot for operations and other stuff. So yeah, not exactly an answer to your question, but I think I was originally obsessed by the sort of just the team vibe in these complex creative pursuits. And then over time, I kind of expanded that out to different circles.
You talk a lot about the embracing of uncertainty and the messiness of product work. Being somebody who's worked in public companies or VC-backed companies where that's not really acceptable in some cases. They want like firm deadlines. They want to know when things need to be put into place, and they want commitments. Do you ever struggle with, having to kind of balance between the two? And do you have, how would you recommend somebody who's in that situation balance between the two methodologies?
I think the trick is talking about uncertainty with certainty. And I wrote this blog post that basically was called Skeptoptimism, which is like who I think I am, a skeptical optimist, meaning stuff's gonna break. Things are not gonna work out. But you can adapt the way you're working to be able to make regular progress, and you can start figuring out how to discuss the progress you're making. And so a lot of it is how teams communicate the game. If a company sets the game as hitting things by certain dates all the time and they only talk about it after you've missed the date, that's not a great game. That you're not going to get a lot of luck talking about that game. But if you said to yourself, look, that thing's going to ship on September 7th. It's going to ship no matter what we do. Now the game is to figuring out how we are going to create the best opportunities for our company given that constraint. So you go into your meetings and say, these are the areas of risk. This is how we've reduced uncertainty across those risks. This is what we learned last week. This is the progress that we made. This is the big risk right now. This is how we're mitigating it. This is how we're measuring progress and success and doing all that kind of stuff. So it's really funny because when I think back on making a record or recording, you had a game in mind. And even though it was really hard, you're making progress. You're laying down tracks. You're doing new revisions. You're taking new takes. Like, even though it's weird and you still had a way to understand progress. And so I think that that's about reframing what it means to make progress and educating the other people you're working with about the game that's being played. And once you do that and see it from that perspective, it sort of really changes stuff, because most people fall into the trap of either insisting on communicating the game they want to communicate, but the people who are listening believe it's another game. That's never going to work. Or falling into the trap of being like, well, guess we're in the deadline world now. I'm going to have to talk their game. And that doesn't work. And the third category is like talking about the right game in the right way and educating the people you're talking to also think about, like, co-create the game together in a way that makes sense. And then do that. So when these teams are like, oh, for me, deadlines don't matter. Of course they matter to someone. And so if you walk into a room and be like, the geniuses will figure it out when we figure it out, you're never going to make that many friends that way. And similar to, like, an example is firefighting. I was so amazed. Santa Barbara had these really bad fires a couple of years ago. And every day there was a fire chief who would come and do a talk on TV of our local TV station, and you could also live stream it. I obsessively watched this talk because something clicked in my head. This is an incredibly volatile situation with so many moving parts, but the way that they communicated the game and the progress on the game and the allocation of resources to play the game and what was important for people to understand was next level about that. And so I think that that's kind of like really was inspiring to watch that particular thing, because it's a great demonstration of, like, there's the game. You couldn't have talked about, if he talked about like a sports game, like, oh, it looks like we just punted the ball right now and we're on the 10th yard line or whatever. Everyone in the audience would have been like, that is the shittiest way to talk about a volatile fire situation there ever was. But he just happened to communicate the game. And so that's the thought that came to mind.
Yeah, that to me brings up accessibility, right? And I find that, like, I'm seeing a lot of product folks sort of stuck in this pastime of, John, you described it as a game, of the game of like helping their co-leaders or their peers or their CEO founder understand like the art of product.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of like, we are in such a different state now, particularly at this time in the industry. I'm like, nobody has time to hear about the arts and crafts anymore. The game is like
Yeah.
show impact and show it now.
Yeah.
And you know, particularly for product, I read a study not too long ago that said that CPOs have the shortest tenure out of any C-suite member at a company. It's 2.5 years, right?
Yeah.
And I think not all of that, but at least some of that has to do with exactly what you're talking about, right? It's like they're either not figuring out what game they're in, they're trying to push like their own agenda, um, or something else, right? It's I guess what I'm hearing from you is number one, like make it accessible and easy and lean into what the environment gives you in a way. Is that right?
Yeah. And also maybe what the environment requires, right?
Right.
Like, um, a great example of this is just a super simple example, but there's an overarching principle in product that relates to there is a sort of sense of phases of a product or phases of a feature area or phases of an
Yeah.
operational capability or anything. And roughly it goes like in the beginning, there's a lot of hit or misses and you're sort of trying to figure out what you're going to do. And then there's this period of early growth where you could literally throw darts at the thing and build anything or build any operations capability and you'd be okay.
Right.
The next level is like more of disciplined optimization. You need a little bit more disciplined optimization at that point because you need to cut short things that are not working. Then you get into this stage where any improvement is hard and you have to weigh the idea of should we disrupt this or end of life it, or should we try to get to the next level? So this is a basic model, right? And so this is a great example of like people will go in their company and they'll say, you know, this is a big product ops problem where they'll say, well, we've figured out the right framework for everyone to talk about stuff.
Right.
They're going to all use these KPIs. They're going to all use this. Depending on where you are in that progression, your meetings will look very, very, very different. If you're in the throw darts at it and just get out of that team's way. You basically need to know that numbers are going up and to the right and you're okay. If you're in that early discovery phase, you need to understand where like you need to protect them, but make sure that they're not going too far off. If you're in the disciplined optimization mode, this is like A/B testing. You need to support them. If you're in the end of life thing where just even any tiny improvement and cost reduction or margin improvement is a win, you're going to have a different QBR. You're going to have a different meeting. So what a lot of product ops people need to think about is that you obviously can't have 15 categories of everything because that will make people's head explode. But you can't have one for everything. And so you need to like weave in the right models and the right approaches given the context that you're dealing with to make sure that you're having the most productive meeting, the most productive review, the most productive approach to measuring things. And if you don't keep the differences in mind, if you try a one size fits all approach, it's not going to be as effective as you want. And so that's like a one example of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. I just, as soon as you started talking about that, I just saw like the maturity curve in my mind.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm curious, like, Darren, from your perspective as a go-to-market operator, right? Like, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what John is saying here, because there's so much like strange little nuance in product. And I'm, you know, I think on the go-to-market side, coming from sales and customer success myself, right? I think about it in terms of like the team maturity curve, like where the customers are at. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if you're just like, man, product is insane, arts and crafts, weirdness. Like, what are you guys doing over there?
You know, for me, from my perspective, I feel like there's like this ever evolving disconnect between product and go to market because where product is looking to develop a good, right? And they're looking at creating an experience for a customer. The go to market side is looking at how do we deliver that to somebody? And the metrics are intrinsically not tied together, right? One's about delivery and one's about creation. And so when you think about the two of them, like anytime I'm getting into an engagement with somebody from product, it's always about trying to find that middle ground of like, hey, how do we align what we're trying to achieve, right? A product wants to deliver a really great product, and go-to-market wants to sell it. But I guess one of the follow-up questions I have for you, John, is if you're looking at metrics to assess the success of a product delivery, what are some of the ones that you feel like are the most important that could also align and help bridge the gap between product ops and go-to-market ops?
Oh, I love that. I mean, I can give an example at Amplitude, for example. When I worked there, we had a North Star metric, which is called weekly learning users. We had some inputs, which were like activated accounts. And then there was this thing called broadcasted learnings and consumption of learnings. So you could think about activated accounts. You needed to get data flowing. You need to get data in the system. You need to get moving. You need to be, there's a certain number of active users in the product. Broadcasted learnings, you could think about as almost like the creator experience, where you have the nerds who are trying to figure out the insight and they broadcast it. So if I had a learning and I sent it to you, Darren and Mackenzie, that would count as a broadcasted learning. I would need to send it to you, but you'd need to receive it and look at it. So that's a broadcast learning. Now, consumption of learnings was the long tail consumption of learning. So a team makes it into their dashboard or whatever. So it's kind of meta to think about because we're talking about metrics and I'm talking about a company that's doing their own metrics. But one of the interesting things is weekly learning users was something that it wasn't always great. But weekly learning users became something that customer success and sort of onboarding teams and other things really pinned on. Because if they were responsible for that idea of activating those accounts. Now, marketing was a little bit different, right? Where life cycle marketing could tie into some of those metrics. More top of the funnel type stuff, a little bit further away, right? Like is a little further away from that motion. So there were things that, but there's our components. Like if you had champions who are going out there into the world, and in our community is a good example. Like if you have existing customers in the community, they're active members of the community. That's a great example, in fact, of a top of funnel motion that marketing is getting involved in that also links to them. Are they a weekly active user? Weekly learning user? So you can start to see, I think that there's always these opportunities. Like you're never going to win 100%, and there's going to be things that feel more go-to-market-ish than product-ish. But there are opportunities to think about that, and some which are very tightly coupled, like that activating accounts. So whereas I think for a long time, our marketing team was like, we got to load up, N number of stage 2 opportunities. Now, there's even connections with that. You load up the wrong persona, even if they get to stage 2, they're not going to become activated accounts, and they're not going to become weekly learning users. Right, to do that. So I think it's about, one of the things I've been talking about lately is instead of trying to think about one metric to rule them all, or one set of metrics to rule them all, it's almost think about it as Venn diagrams. There's things that, like if you're on a UX team, there might be things about the usability of something, which you'll care a lot about, but they might be more tangential to what the other groups are thinking about. And yet there's things involved in the experience of the product, which very much sit front and center at the overlap of go-to-market and the experience of the product, and product management and engineering, for example, sit into those particular things. So that's kind of how I generally think about it, where don't work too hard to find common metrics for everything that the whole company can agree on. Maybe there's one or two of those that everyone can agree on, but then allow the teams to sort of evolve their own areas and then find and map the overlaps in sensible ways is how I've been thinking about it lately.
I like that. I like that a lot. And John, you posted something recently that I really liked, and Darren and I are completely aligned on this. This is like something that we had to do for a very large company, is like figure out the metrics that everybody can get on board with, like the centralized ones that you're talking about. It's not easy, but I liked your recommendation there, which was essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're like, hey, just get started. Like figure out a couple of metrics, like monitor those, have conversations about them on a weekly or bi-weekly, monthly basis, like see if they're good. And if they're not good metrics, vote them down. And
Yeah.
I think the three of us are very much about just get started. And
Yeah.
I find that a lot of teams like still really resist that, right? It's like this
Yeah.
perfectionist tweak that particularly, you see come up in the product and engineering world.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like we had a research conversation recently and we talked a lot about this topic. And I'm curious what you're hearing from other uh product operators and what's going on in your listening tour.
A couple of themes have come up in chatting with a lot of operations folks. One is this problem where basically lapses in leadership become operations problems, and then they try to fill the gaps, and then they get blamed for not having filled the gaps. Like if a leader is not willing to stand behind a way of operating and basically like, well, I'm going to let my product operations folks figure out the nitty gritty of the process here. They're basically kind of trying to be hands off. And I think that that's such like an interesting problem, right? Where you get product ops filling the gaps, or you
Yeah.
get go-to-market ops or whatever filling the gaps, but people aren't truly committed. Like leadership is not truly committed to the new way. They're not talking about it from the rooftops. They're almost like a little hands off. So that's like one thing you see. I noticed a lot of operations folks slip into that trap.
Yep.
One thing, and I heard that over and over. The second thing is this idea that like how you operate is just an internal product. And it can
Yep.
be treated as an internal product. Like
Yep.
these platforms that like the difference between a platform, which is meant to, so backing up, one way someone could think about it is there's this thing called team topologies, which is a way to think about an organization. It's a great book called Team Topologies. And in that book, they talk about value stream teams or value teams, platform teams, enablement teams, and specialized subsystem teams. So value teams is sort of a pretty direct line out to customers. It's something customers are doing. Platform teams offer basically supporting building blocks or services to those other teams, ideally in kind of a semi-low touch way. Enabling teams get higher touch when they collaborate, but they're not there all the time. They're meant to be like a supporting function when you need it. And complicated subsystem teams are areas of specialty which are very, very difficult to replicate. And, so for example, there's like super high specialization around ABM that only like not that many people in the world know. And you have a specialist, who's thinking about the ABM stuff. But now ABM could be broken down into the data, the strategies. Anyway, we could go there. So the interesting thing when you think about it like that is that you have to be honest with yourself about what some of your operations functions are and who the customer is. Is this a multi-sided thing where you're trying to keep the teams happy and leadership happy? Or is this ultimately a capability you're offering to leaders? And if it's offering to leaders, how do you keep in check problems that could be for their downstream? Are you linked immediately to a value stream? So are you, for example, like commercialization and launching commercialization is something that touches every part of the organization and needs a number of supporting functions like around pricing, around communication, around PMM. There's all kinds of things. There's the value stream, but then there's all these supporting platforms and supporting enablement functions and areas of specialization to do that. So one theme that I've been learning from the operations people who are really thinking deeply about this is they're not just going into this thinking to themselves, what must I automate or whatever. They're thinking of it as like a portfolio of motions that they're offering to different folks in the company at different levels of maturity, different capabilities, different KPIs, different prioritization. And so it's like a portfolio of platform products, enablement functions. A good example is a big trap, it seems, in some companies is somehow product ops is burdened with the idea of up-leveling the whole org in terms of their product skills. Now, that's not a bad thing, but they're not really empowered to do that. So then this is this question, like, should they just be a platform and so what I mean by that is when teams need help with their product stuff, they go to your platform and pull out learning or request, or are they an enablement function where when a team is thinking about the training they want that quarter, they ping product ops and say, hey, might need your help? Or are leaders the customers? And ultimately, the leaders are trying to up-level all the teams and push change to the team. Those are three very, very different collaboration modes. And so what you notice is that the best operators or best operations folks have a deep sense. They might not use the same words that I'm using. They have a deep sense of when it's pull, when it's push, when it's a platform, when it's something that they should be in people's face, when it's more of a coordination function, when they should be something that's never seen, or when they should be something that's completely seen. Yeah, those are some, that third point I think is kind of interesting, sort of like a mindset thing.
I want to go back to the first point that you made about sort of leadership. I'm trying to think of like how you put it exactly. Like leadership standing on business, I want to say, of like, here's how we're going to operate and here's how we're going to do things. I'm really curious to hear what you think because I have a heavy point of view on this, which is that we need to stop playing Wizard of Oz here and look behind the curtain and realize that there are many people operating in the C-suite that aren't holding ground or aren't standing on business because they actually don't know. And that's fine. But everybody's also operating in this space of a lot of fear right now in tech in particular, and being anxious about being wrong. And I think, not having a leader there to really back, what you're trying to do is really hard. And I think, as operators, you are setting a tone in a lot of ways. And as you're saying, we don't necessarily always have the power to do things, but it feels like ops is just shouldering a lot right now. And
Oh, yeah.
there's something there. There's the anxiety trickle down. There's the leaders not, standing up because they either don't know or they're too anxious and afraid of their own jobs. And a lot is being, pinned to ops. And I want to hear if that's what you're hearing around or if there's a different perspective, if I'm totally off.
I mean, this is this problem of glue rolls. And frankly, you can tell that this similar sentiments come up with like UX researchers kind of they sit at the confluence of different areas of the org. People in go to market, especially the people in product marketing, they've had to like absorb all the changes from different parts of companies. There's a lot of chaos in companies at the moment. And anyone in operations, these are teams that are being like halved in size or even more. People with enablement in their title, it's a little bit like, do we really need people enabling? Because, if we just had great leaders, we wouldn't need anyone enabling anything. And so, yeah, it's been pretty brutal out there for operations and for these things because in the current environment, for multiple reasons, not just economic, but also just vibes, this is a problem. So yeah, it's definitely like there's a lot of collective trauma at the moment in people in operations, and anyone expected to kind of coordinate the whole.
John, I was talking to somebody just the other day about software as a whole, and one of the things that I've noticed is where there's a big push to do more right now over
Yeah.
prioritizing and doing the right thing. And, with maybe it's VC pressure or it may be, board pressure where you just need to deliver. You got to deliver fast iterations of different things. I guess from your perspective, what's the best way to look at where you should prioritize and focus
Yeah.
on the bigger impactful projects versus where should you focus on some quantity to deliver some stuff? And does that tie into like, can you tie that into any advice for people who might be going into a new company to lead product ops versus, somebody who's wanting to overhaul their own existing team?
Well, I think that to go back to the portfolio idea, I think that relates to operations at the moment. One error state I see at the following is that there's operations leaders who are like, you know what? I've got my day job, but my night job is figuring out how to solve our strategy because that's the root cause of the whole problem. Or go to market like, oh, if we could just, I'm doing this fancy thing. I think people need to accept that right now things are going to be chaotic. And so I talk about a portfolio of things. Like 50% of the stuff you do should either be removing stuff or just making people's lives easier in ways that they will realize in under 1 day.
Yes.
Just my life is easier. Like 50 or more percent of those things, right? And then I was talking to someone the other day, and these were my breakdowns. Like 50% or more should just be stuff like that. Things where capabilities or things where you can provide immediate benefit, remove stuff, shift things that could be more transactional, but are currently more collaborative. You're more in each other's face right now than you need to be. Legitimately, and because the reverse is also a need, things where people could be more collaborative, but are forced to be transactional. But what you find out is if you solve some of the busy work problems, you leave more time in the day for the collaborative work that you need to do. So 50% of the work you should be doing should be stuff that can be more transactional, wiring stuff together, making people's life easier, reducing duplicate form entries, making data quality easier, just run the thing. Even if the strategy is completely messed up with the company or whatever, like just don't think about that for a little bit. And then I think it's good to like 25% of the stuff should be kind of the next level up of like slightly more long-term capabilities that there's general consensus about the leaders. And here's a good example is something like dependency resolution. Now, it's a little bit more complex than the first category I talked about and involves a bit more prioritization from the company. But generally, you could find a group of leaders that are like, look, we're going to have to resolve dependencies no matter what we're doing. And we're not going to be eliminating our dependencies anytime soon. There's no plans to eliminate the number of dependencies. We're not going to hire more people. We're not fixing our platforms. We've done all the reorgs that we think we can do, and we still have all the dependencies that we need. That's a good example of that next tier of things, which is slightly more complex. They're not immediate pain killing. It's a little bit more systems thinking involved. But ultimately, there's some consensus that would be great if you could fix it. It's a little tougher. So that's that second category of things. And then just leave the last 25% to be the more speculative, try to help the company work its shit out type stuff. So really, if you're not doing the bulk of stuff is not pain killing, and then the second category are things that like are slightly harder that you could help with. So in go-to-market, an example is like just plain stitching products together, stitching tools together and getting higher. People should be able to launch a landing page in 24 hours or less. Okay, so we know you got to have that, so make that happen. The second category would be a little bit around like architecture stuff, like people say they want it. They want to be able to tag releases with enterprise and then maybe have like some release notes put together for that. It's a little bit more complex. It involves more strategic alignment around the market categories, whatever. That's like a second tier thing. And then the third tier would be like, can we just please freaking fix our strategy? Much harder to do. So that's how I would break it down for people.
I think Darren and I needed this talk like a few years ago because like he and I are addicted to solving the big insane problems, and I'm like, I need to focus on the ball of chaos. But John, I think that's the point, right? Like we are operating in wartime right now, essentially,
Yeah.
right? Like it is just chaos, and we need to accept that, but it's hard, right? As operators, I think a lot of us are control freaks, right? We're the people that
Yeah.
see around the corners and sort of like navigate the insanity and take all the complex stuff and hopefully make it simpler and easier. So it's a tough environment to operate in. I'm curious to hear, like, because people are operating from a point of fear and anxiety, I imagine a lot of people lean on you to have like these venting conversations. You're sort of the guy
Yeah.
in product that people are like, John has the answers, right? So that must be a lot of pressure. But also I'm curious to hear, like, what are the conversations that you're having where you're like, I wish people just would talk about this in the open. Like, you serve as a
Oh,
mouthpiece for a lot of people, by the way. Like, you're I don't know if the word like you're just bold, you're just authentically yourself on LinkedIn. People are very scared, and it's refreshing, it's authentic. So I'm curious to hear like what people are saying where you're like, just come out, let's talk about it. Like, let's get this shit on the table and discuss it.
Yeah, it's a very hard question because I have obviously um, kind of have the privilege to do that as much as I want. I mean, I'm going to have a job no matter what. I mean, even if I have to like resort to consulting, not even if I have to resort to consulting is great. Running your own consultancy is an awesome thing to be doing. But so I have options because I've just built up a network to do things. So I'm able to take a more kind of bold stance about it. I mean, I think let's just focusing in on companies for a second.
Yeah.
There's just this, there's this terrible wicked loop happening in companies right now where all the escalation mechanisms of the companies are broken down and people don't want to talk about what might be broken. Like anything you could fix on the team level, you fix.
Right.
But anything that has to do with other groups or other things like that doesn't get escalated. And so because it's not getting escalated, if you reverse and if you're on the other side of this, you're kind of like, I have no idea what's going on. I guess the only way to solve this problem is to let go of 20% of the team because someone told me maybe people don't work or whatever or something, or we're going to RTO. That's going to be great.
Mhm.
And so with a generous interpretation of that problem, one could say that like the strata or the layers and the communication between these layers are broken down. So people desperately on the front lines want to be like, we have not been able to get one thing done in the last 5 weeks
Mhm.
because there is no strategy. And we're all sitting here paralyzed now, but no one will say that right now, right?
Nobody
Because
will say
people
that.
are like, well, if we say you're paralyzed, that means the team's not productive. And that
And you're
means
not
that the
working.
team's,
You need to go first.
yeah,
Exactly.
you need to go first on these things. So I think it's very naive of me to say this. I mean, there's a lot going on with that thing, but I think that one thing that strikes me is just if you could in your company, it's almost like a level of acceptance, but by having a level of acceptance, it opens up new possibilities. Like if you just accept that all the escalation paths are broken and you accept that, that also is kind of liberating in a way in how you communicate to your team, right? So instead of just imagine if a leader said, guess what? Through no necessary fault of everyone at the company, we all have a part in it. But all of our communication channels are broken down because I understand that everyone's scared that we're going to do another set of layoffs. And because of that, um, only the people who are super confident about their job are the ones who speak up, and the
Mhm.
rest of the people don't. And from a leadership perspective, we don't even really know what's going on. But I want to create this environment where we can reset that. And this is an idea of how we might be able to do it. I think what people don't realize is, oh my God, I think if a leader would say that in a company, like 99% of the people in the company would take this massive collective sigh of relief. And you would be an order of magnitude more effective and efficient as a company. So, all this stuff around efficiency and all this crap, it's making companies vastly less efficient, which is ironic, right? To do these things. So I think that that's kind of my general thing. Like, I don't know the answer to this problem, but it seems like it's an opportunity there for the taking if you could just accept the situation as it is right now instead of trying to pretend it was something else. And that there should be companies out there that suddenly like, I'm being way too optimistic. Suddenly like a switch flips and they're vastly more effective if they could do that. So yeah, I don't know. That's a thought that I have.
John, I've loved this conversation. When I first met Mackenzie, I got like a look behind the curtain into product ops. And I feel like I've just kind of had my eyes opened even more after talking with you today. So I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. I have two last questions for you. One, if you have any advice for product operations people that you think is increasingly important for them to know in order to be successful. And then 2, if people want to get engaged with you, how should they connect with you?
Yeah. The one advice is become a broken record about mostly boring things where you're making regular progress on that stuff. Like things are messed up right now, but you can, if you just walk into each meeting and be like, I want to remind people what our 3 areas of focus are, and here's the 16 different capabilities we're hoping to strengthen the next year, and this is what we're focusing on this quarter, and this is how we're going to measure progress here, and this is what we did last week, and this is what we did this week, and these are the positive signals of what we saw. And just become a broken record and like, let me test my understanding. Have priorities changed? We're open to change. We can change anything 6 weeks out or later. How should we adjust what we're doing? So I think that that's the general thing, is like, there's an opportunity at the moment if you just I was about to say simplify, but you just got to become a broken record and set a good example for the other people around you. Like, and set a good example for yourself about what you're doing and how you're working through this time. So I think people misunderstand that. And the way this manifests is you'll see a leader being like, I've been working for 6 weeks on my new strategy framework and I'm thinking about it. That is 6 weeks that you miss the opportunity to just be like, here's the 6 work streams. This is what we're doing. These are the risks. Like you've missed 6 weeks of being able to educate people on the game. So I'd leave people with that. And then for us, for getting in touch, LinkedIn is good, or Substack, where I have the beautiful mess at the moment. You could try to reach out there. I have a feeling, yeah, when it sends the emails, I think it actually sends it from me. So people then learn that they can reply to those messages. Yeah, that's it. That's what I'm thinking.
We'll make sure to put some of the links in the video as well, so people can get in touch with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, John.
Thanks again, John.
Cool. Yep. Have a great day.
You too.